His face, swollen by the poison, twisted into a grotesque blend of surprise and demand, like a child who never learned that the universe is not obligated to obey him. Joffrey Baratheon died with his eyes open, as if even his final breath refused to accept that the world no longer turned at his command. Thus fell the one who believed himself invincible, the king who never understood he was the villain of his own story. And as his body convulsed in a final, almost cartoonish dance, something shattered forever in the banquet hall. The illusion. The illusion that power can protect a rotten soul. The illusion that arrogance can stand in for greatness. The illusion that a monster incapable of seeing itself could rule without reality eventually demanding a price. His end was neither heroic nor tragic. It was inevitable, almost poetic, as if the universe in a rare moment of justice had finally said, enough. But to understand that death, to grasp why his end felt more like a sigh of relief than a tragedy, one must go back. One must walk backward through the years to find the threads that wove this fate. Because no monster appears out of nowhere. Even villains have an origin, a first heartbeat, a first cry. And although we are not going to humanize him, because Joffrey was not a misunderstood child nor a wounded soul, we can analyze the pieces that formed him, the silences that surrounded him, the shadows that applauded each of his gestures. Not to justify him, but to understand how, sometimes, evil doesn't need excuses, only opportunities. Joffrey Baratheon was born among luxuries, but also among lies. He was not the king's son, though all his life he believed he was. His blood did not carry the rugged strength of Robert Baratheon, but the quiet echo of a secret that should never have seen the light of day. From the very first day, his existence was a fraud, a deception that walked with a crowned head. And perhaps there, in that first falsehood, the seed of his sickened ego was planted, this delirious conviction that the world belonged to him by right, even if that right was nothing more than a carefully manufactured illusion. From childhood, he showed tendencies many preferred to interpret as strength. He broke things. He ordered silence from anyone who dared contradict him. He observed pain with an unsettling curiosity, like someone watching a bonfire while trying to calculate how much wood is needed to keep the flames alive forever. And here, inevitably, one wonders, are some hearts born leaning toward the shadow, or is it simply the first applause that pushes them there? Because in real life, just like in Westeros, there are people who only need a spark to reveal the wildfire they carry inside. People who do not wish to build, but to burn, even if burning means consuming themselves. His childhood unfolded wrapped in silk and silence. Cersei protected him with an almost animal ferocity, but the worst part wasn't her protection, it was her approval. Every cruel gesture, every small abuse, every tantrum-turned decree was celebrated as a sign of authority, as if a bad temper were the mark of a great king. And little by little, Joffrey learns something dangerous, that power could be used as a toy, that cruelty could be misunderstood for strength, that every whim could be transformed into law. At some point, he stopped being a child and began to become a storm that sought neither rain nor wind, but absolute control. When King Robert died, his world opened like a stage set only for him. It was his moment. His coronation was not just the rise of a monarch, but the official birth of his unrestrained ego. That day, while the crowd shouted his name, he felt something he had never felt before, the confirmation of his own narrative. He was the chosen one. He was the hero. He was the master of everyone else's fate. He never asked himself whether he had the capacity to rule, whether he should listen to his advisors, whether he should govern with caution. Caution is for those who recognize their limits, and Joffrey never recognized any. He believed he stood above them, above everyone.
And here, reflection becomes inevitable. How many times in our lives have we seen someone like him? Not with a crown, perhaps, but with the same blindness. People who, with a bit of power, a position, a title, a last name, convince themselves that their word is law. People who do not listen, who do not doubt, who do not feel. People who believe themselves heroes even as their actions destroy those around them. Joffrey is a reminder that evil does not always hide in deep shadows. Often it walks in broad daylight, dressed in gold and smiling with satisfaction, while the world convinces itself that it is normal to feel afraid in its presence. During his short reign, Joffrey showed what he had always been, a child with absolute power and no sense of self-awareness. He ordered executions to feel control. He humiliated those he was meant to protect. He confused authority with sadism and justice with spectacle. In his mind, everything was a game designed to showcase his bravery. But there was no bravery, only insecurity in disguise, fear concealed. A mind too small trying to fill the enormous space demanded by a crown. And still he never doubted, not for a second, because the most dangerous villains are not those who know they do wrong, but those who commit it believing they are right. In those dark years, King's Landing was not a city but a board game. Every move he made left a trail of resentment, suppressed rage, terror disguised as obedience. And the onlooker, us who watch the fictional story and also the real ones, feels something unsettling, a strange fascination for the villain who destroys himself. Because Joffrey did not only ruin the lives of others, he dug his own grave with the same arrogance with which he sat on the Iron Throne, a throne that ironically cut him more than anyone else. In this first part of his story, the guiding thread is always the same. A child who never understood the meaning of limits. A teenager who mistook fear for respect. A king who grew up without learning the difference between commanding and governing. And an ego so swollen that it turned every step he took into a self-fulfilling prophecy toward disaster. Joffrey was not the product of tragedy or misfortune. He was the product of permission. And evil, when granted permission, always finds reasons to expand. As we move forward in Joffrey's story, the landscape grows rougher, denser, more unsettling. He is no longer the child who received his mother's blind approval, nor the heir who walked among whispers of power. Now he is the king, and it is precisely here that his ego, swollen and overflowing, finds the absolute freedom to reveal itself as it truly is. A child with the sharpest crown in the world, holding it with trembling hands, incapable of understanding its weight. A young man who mistook the fear of others for admiration, failing to realize that every silent glance was a warning of the downfall approaching. From his earliest days on the throne, Joffrey made it clear that his reign would not be remembered for wisdom or justice, but for impulses. Impulses born from a dark, almost primitive place where cruelty was not a choice, but a natural reaction. Power, in its most dangerous form, does not transform people, it simply reveals what was already there. And what existed within Joffrey was a desperate need to assert himself, to feel big in a world that never taught him true greatness. A world where everyone applauded him, but no one guided him. Where everyone feared his words, but no one dared whisper the truth. You are not a king. You are a child playing at war. One of the defining moments of his reign was the execution of Ned Stark. Not because it was a political move, he did not understand politics, but because it was the first time the world saw, without masks, Joffrey's true nature. He did not order that death to secure his throne. He ordered it out of impulse, out of vanity, out of that sickly instinct tyrants have to demonstrate their power through the blood of the noble. For him, cutting off the head of an honorable man was not a tragedy. It was a symbolic coronation. It was his grotesque way of shouting to Westeros that he stood above everything, that justice was a toy in his hands, that making others suffer made him feel alive.
And it is impossible not to pause the story for a moment and reflect on what this really means. Because Joffrey, though a fictional character, represents a type of person that exists in the real world. People who make decisions from insecurity, from rage, from a wound so deep they never learned to see it. People who destroy what they touch because they believe destruction is the only path to respect. People who mistake silence for admiration and fear for loyalty. And just as Joffrey ordered a beheading to feel powerful, there are those in our everyday lives who destroy friendships, betray trust, or humiliate others just to feel they control something, even for a moment. Returning to Westeros, Ned Stark's death was not merely a political mistake. It was the spark that ignited fires Joffrey never understood. War erupted. Blood was spilled in his name. Entire lands burned because of a decision he made without thinking. And even then, in his mind, he still saw himself as a hero. He believed his firm hand made him the great king he always dreamed of being, without understanding that a king is not defined by strength, but by vision. The ability to see beyond oneself, to understand the fabric of consequences. And Joffrey saw nothing. He did not see suffering. He did not see chaos. He did not see pain. He saw only his own reflection, distorted by the crown, magnified by the fear of others. His relationship with Sansa Stark is another window into his diseased soul. With her, Joffrey found someone onto whom he could project his deepest insecurity. Every humiliation, every brutal act, every absurd order served a clear purpose, reminding himself that he had power. She was his mirror of dominance, and he needed that mirror to avoid facing the internal reality he feared so much. But his cruelty towards Sansa reveals something even more disturbing: his total inability to see another human being as an equal. Joffrey did not perceive people. He perceived pawns, living statues created to obey him. He did not understand that Sansa was a human being with fear, with dignity, with a life of her own. To him, she was simply a mandatory audience, someone forced to watch his spectacle of tyranny without looking away. And once again, with another inevitable pause, the story opens into introspection. How many times have we known people who can only relate through domination, humiliation, imposition? People who need someone beneath them to feel above. People who listen only to confirm their superiority, never to understand. Joffrey is the extreme symbol of those individuals who, incapable of building anything of value within themselves, rip value from those around them. For those who have nothing to give, often dedicate themselves to taking. His relationship with his mother, Cersei, was a strange dance between devotion and resentment. She had shaped him, fed him praise, wrapped him in a bubble of adoration, and yet he treated her with the same coldness he used on everyone else. Not from lack of affection, because Joffrey did not know how to feel affection, but because, in his mind, any figure of authority was a threat to his throne, even his own mother. That is the destiny of those who live trapped inside their own ego. Everyone becomes a potential enemy. Everyone must be diminished. Everyone must be silenced. Absolute power is absolute loneliness, and Joffrey walked through his reign surrounded by people who feared him but never loved him. And to him, that was fine, because he did not need love. He needed obedience. His reign advanced like a slow, merciless winter. Every decision increased the people's resentment. Every impulsive act weakened his legitimacy. Every whim isolated him a little more. And still he remained convinced he was a hero, that he was building a golden age, that all who criticized him were traitors, weaklings, enemies of greatness. This inability to perceive reality is the signature mark of villains who believe themselves heroes. No matter what they destroy, they always find an excuse to justify themselves. In their minds, the world is always to blame, never them. Over time, even the Lannisters began to see him as an inevitable problem. Tywin understood he was not facing a king, but a bomb. A bomb that would explode sooner or later, taking not only his enemies but his own family with it. But Joffrey never sensed the danger. Because diseased egos do not feel real fear. They feel irritation, annoyance, discomfort, but never fear. They believe they are invincible, not because they are, but because imagining any other possibility would be unbearable. And so, without realizing it, Joffrey continued opening wounds, accumulating enemies, sowing resentment in every soul that crossed his path. His days had been numbered long before his purple wedding, but he never saw it coming, because seeing the end requires introspection, and he lived in a darkness where introspection was impossible. The final stretch of Joffrey Baratheon's life was not a march toward triumph, but a parade toward the abyss, though he never knew it. And that is the most ironic, most unsettling, most poetic detail of his story. He died without understanding that he was falling. He died believing he was rising. He died convinced that he was loved, respected, feared, celebrated. Because in his mind, no other possibility could exist. Ego does not break. Ego defends itself, even if it must invent entire worlds in order to keep breathing. In the final months, Joffrey lived his reign like a child playing with fire without knowing what fire is. Every gesture burned a little more. Every word ignited some part of the world. Every whim left a burn upon hearts that already carried too many scars. And still he walked among the ruins as if they were flowers. He was so trapped inside his own narrative that he could no longer recognize the signs of danger. He did not see the swelling hatred. He did not hear the exhaustion of his people. He did not perceive the silent contempt growing within his own family, his own council, even his own bride. The shadows moved around him and he continued smiling. Because when someone believes themselves the protagonist of their own tale of glory, they failed to recognize when the story stopped being about them long ago. Joffrey lived convinced that his wedding would mark the beginning of a new era, the absolute triumph of his greatness. He could not see that this very day would be remembered as the precise moment the world decided to breathe again. His purple wedding was a perfect stage for his overflowing ego. Banquets, music, applause, spectacles designed to elevate his image. He absorbed it all with an arrogant smile, that expression so characteristic of him, so childish, so empty. He entered the hall like someone who believes they control every inch of reality. He walked among the guests without suspecting that many of them were not there to celebrate his life, but to witness, perhaps unknowingly, the end he had spent years constructing. Every gesture that day was an unintentional metaphor. Every mockery of his uncle, every absurd command, every humiliation turned into spectacle. All were echoes of a boy who never stopped being a boy, and who confused the applause of others with affection. It was the final performance of a tyrant who believed himself seated at the summit, when in truth he was already dangling from the edge. And then came the cup, that simple, shining object,
heavy with silent destiny. Joffrey took it without a trace of suspicion, because villains who believe themselves heroes never suspect anything. They think the entire universe conspires in their favor, that they are untouchable, that the world would never dare strike them, that the gods bless them, that death is for others, not for them.
The poison traveled down his throat like a truth that had taken far too long to arrive. And suddenly, the boy king, the adolescent tyrant, the villain who never accepted his own shadow, began to choke. The hall erupted in screams. Cersei lunged toward him, desperate, like a mother finally realizing the cost of her decisions. Tyrion watched with that blend of fascination and sorrow that only someone who has witnessed too much injustice can feel. And Joffrey opened his eyes wide. That moment was not merely physical. It was symbolic. It was spiritual. It was the revelation he never could have understood. His eyes opened the way a crack opens, too late to stop the collapse. His face twisted into the question he had never asked, why me? And the answer was everywhere and nowhere, because there is no answer for someone who never accepted responsibility, because there is no comfort for someone who never learned how to love, because there is no noble ending for someone who lived denying the humanity of others. He died without dignity, he died without understanding, he died without redemption. He died being, until the very last second, exactly what he always was. A diseased ego trying to breathe in a world that no longer tolerated his shadow. But here, at the end of the story, the most important reflection emerges. Joffrey is not just a character. He represents something real, something we have all seen, something we have at times felt. Because the world is full of people who believe themselves heroes while destroying lives around them. People who do not listen, who do not accept limits, who confuse power with entitlement and cruelty with strength. People who humiliate in order to exist, who fracture others to feel whole, who wound because their souls never learned anything else. All of us, at some point in our lives, have known a Joffrey. Perhaps in school, at work, in the family, under a failed leadership, in a broken relationship. Individuals incapable of seeing the harm they cause because their ego is larger than their vision. People who burn everything they touch and then ask why they are surrounded by ashes. And the most unsettling part is that some of them do not even know they are the villains of the story. They tell themselves tales in which they are always right, always the victims, always the chosen ones. The story of Joffrey Baratheon is a distorted yet revealing mirror. It shows us that evil often arises not from deep tragedies or invisible wounds. Sometimes it's born simply from permission, from silence, from the absence of boundaries, from the excess of power placed in the wrong hands. It reminds us that even without tragedy, without dark suffering, without a painful past, a villain can still emerge. A small, petty, insecure villain. A villain who believes himself immense because no one ever had the courage to tell him the truth.
And among all these reflections, one more remains, the most intimate, the most uncomfortable. What part of ourselves could turn out like this if no one ever corrected us, if no one ever confronted us, if we never accepted our flaws? How much of Joffrey could grow inside each of us if we ever believed we were above everyone else? His death, then, is not just the end of a character, it is a warning, a reminder that villains don't always have scars. Sometimes they wear crowns, sometimes they wear smiles, sometimes they receive the applause of the whole world, sometimes they go unnoticed until it's already too late. Joffrey the Baratheon died believing he was invincible, but in his fall, we discover something essential. No diseased ego can sustain itself forever. Sooner or later, reality demands payment, Sooner or later, the world stops being afraid. Sooner or later, history, that silent judge, claims what is owed. And as his final breath faded into the air, as his mother wept, as the entire kingdom watched, the universe itself seemed to exhale a sigh it had been holding back for years. The villain had fallen, and for a moment, the world, fictional or real, felt just a little less dark. And so, when the last image of Joffrey dissolves into the air, when we understand that he was never some supernatural monster, but a distorted reflection of what any of us could become under the fire of power, one last question lingers in the shadows. How many Joffreys have walked through our lives without a crown, without a castle, without a throne, yet carrying the same poison in their eyes? Maybe that's why these stories matter, not because we can change them, but because they force us to look into that uncomfortable mirror where we discover that evil doesn't always wear black armor. Sometimes it dresses as a child, a son, a neighbor, a coworker, someone who one day decided the world was theirs to wound. If this reflection made you feel something, if it made you remember, question, or see differently the villains that sometimes cross our path, I invite you to subscribe. Here, we explore stories that not only speak of fictional worlds, but illuminate our own. And if you have something to say, an idea, a different interpretation, or a wound this story touched, leave it in the comments. I'd love to read you.